I am joined today by Nicholas Boggs, and I feel so fortunate because I had a chance to speak with him earlier this summer, and his book is wonderful, and I wanted to be able to share some of this conversation with all of you. The book is New York Times bestselling biography of James Baldwin. It's called Baldwin: A Love Story. It is the first major biography of James Baldwin in over 3 decades. And Nicholas, thank you so much for making time to have this conversation.
This is such an honor, Michelle. It's so great to see you again.
And thank you for pouring yourself into the 654 pages in this book. I think the hardcover version weighs about 8 pounds. And it's worth lugging it around with you because you learn so much about a man that we think we know, but has really been misunderstood, even when he is revered, over many, many decades now. What is your entry point for James Baldwin?
I have several entry points, but the first one was actually in my eighth grade English classroom at Alice Steele Junior High School in Washington, D.C., public school there. The teacher, Mrs. Miles, had put drawings of famous African-American authors all over the walls. So I was one of the few white students at the school at the time, and I look up and there's James Baldwin's eyes staring back at me. So that was my very first memory. But recently, I hadn't talked to her in years, but we spoke on the phone and she said, "No, Nick, you actually came in the eighth grade in a suit and gave a presentation on Baldwin's life." So I guess this biography actually started way back in the 1980s.
Okay, wait, we're not going to just glide right past that. So Mrs. Miles remembered something that I guess you had chosen to forget, that you dressed up and gave an entire presentation. Did that spark a memory? Do you now
No,
recall more about that?
I absolutely do not. I really don't. But Mrs. Miles is a smart, sharp person, so I'm sure she's correct. But I think I also kind of repressed a lot of the experience writing this book. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that kind of explains, Baldwin is unforgettable, but, delving deep into someone's life is both a pleasure and an honor, but also can be quite difficult and challenging. So I think that's
Yeah.
probably.
I love the image of his eyes staring down at you because he had those eyes. And I can imagine how it was inviting and almost intoxicating, as a young student. Who is that person?
Who is that person? And then in the ninth grade, I borrowed my twin sister's copy of Giovanni's Room and read it sort of secretly in my bedroom. And that was transformative for me. And then in college, I discovered this out of print children's book by Baldwin, Little Man, at the Beinecke. And that really was the beginning of the real quest and journey towards writing this book.
It's a big swing to take on writing about James Baldwin. Did someone tap you on the shoulder and say you should do this? Or did you approach your publisher? And if it was the latter, what was the reception?
I definitely was not approached, and I definitely did not plan to write this book. I mean, I discovered this out of print children's book by James Baldwin, and I spent about 15 years trying to get it republished. That's a
And
whole
it was
story.
at the Beinecke Library at Yale, we should say.
Library at Yale. I was in a class on James Baldwin at Yale, and we read everything by him except this children's book. And there was a paragraph in David Leeming's important 1994 biography about this French artist that he'd collaborated with named Joran Kazak. So I wrote an email, the second email of my life, to David Leeming saying, "Do you know anything about Joran Kazak?" He wrote me back. He said, "I never met him. I don't know anybody alive who met him, and I believe he's dead." This was 1996. So about 7 years later, I moved to New York, and I send emails out to art historians in Paris saying, "Do you know anything about Joran Kazak? Here's my phone number." And I'm sitting in my studio apartment in Brooklyn in 2003. The phone rings, and it's a 65-year-old raspy French accented man saying, "I'm Joran Kazak. I'm alive. Come to Paris. I have many stories to tell you about Jimmy." And so that, I guess, was being tapped on the shoulder in a way, this sort of ghost, what I thought was a ghost from the past, telling me, "Tell this story." I didn't know that it was his whole life story that would happen, but that was the beginning of the quest.
So how long before you got on the plane to go to France?
Well, I had to borrow some money from my mother, and I had to take out a third credit card. And it was a few months later. That was like 4 or 5 months later. And before that, I met with Judith Thurman, the biographer and New Yorker writer, who was good friends with Joran Kazak, it turns out. And she had said to me around then, "You should write a Baldwin biography." And I said, "No way, I could never do that." But then I went over to Paris and I met him and his wife Beatrice and their son Balthazar, who is Baldwin's godson, in fact. Joran died, unfortunately, 2 years later, but I went back to Paris the summer before and interviewed him for many, many, many weeks. And he was just this extraordinary outsider artist, a protege of Balthus, and Baldwin dedicated If Beale Street could talk to him and worked on Little Man, which here's a first edition copy of Little Man
I
that went
have the
out.
reprint here.
And here is the copy. Baldwin gave Joran Kazak a copy of the Black Book to use as kind of a model. And here is the actual copy that belonged to James Baldwin that he gave to Joran Kazak in 1972. Yeah.
Okay, I'm getting emotional just looking at that because I've written about the Black Book. My parents had a copy of the Black Book, and I pored over it when I was a kid. And then later, when it was reissued, this was a book that was put together by Toni Morrison when she was an editor at Random. And if you're not familiar with this, this will be part of the syllabus that Nick will create for you in the course of our conversation. So you should get Little Man, but you should also get the Black Book because it is a compendium, an encyclopedia of Black genius, of Black triumph
Yep.
against great odds. And it's just a book that jumps off the page in all kinds of beautiful ways. It's a scrapbook and a pastiche, and it's kind of messy in the way that it's put together, but that is by design to kind of show you that there was a torrent of talent that we've never heard about.
Talent, and also it doesn't shy away from documenting the great challenges that this country has thrown at African Americans. It has slave auction documents. It has all kinds of Sambo images too. Like it's really takes you into the triumphs, but also, it doesn't shy away from showing the kind of racism that had to be confronted time and time again.
Yeah, yeah. Man hanging from a tree over a fire,
Exactly.
that I remember seeing that and talking to my parents about it. Uncomfortable conversation, but something I needed to see growing up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, raised by a man who came from Birmingham, Alabama, and knew of those things. How was that a blueprint for Little Man, Little Man?
This is actually fascinating talking to you about it because I had never hearing that your parents gave it to you as a kid or even a teenager helps me actually understand why Little Man is called a children's book for adults and an adult's book for children. Maybe the Black Book is too. I hadn't really
Mm-hmm.
thought that
Mm-hmm.
was one of the
Mm-hmm.
reasons that maybe Baldwin gave it to him. But Little Man is it's a beautiful book with these colorful illustrations. It looks and feels like a children's book, and it has a lot of pleasure and fun in it. But it also deals with police brutality, the surveillance of the mass media, alcoholism, drug addiction, sort of the challenges and the pleasures that these children face growing up in Harlem. So, wow, I had never thought of the Black Book as actually being from kind of the same genre in its own way, something that you can share, that adults and children can kind of share together to work through and address these issues. So thank you.
Yeah. My parents, they didn't actually give it to me. They bought it. It was for the house, but we were allowed, my sisters and I were allowed to read it, but we couldn't, like, you couldn't have Doritos fingers. You couldn't you had to wash your hands and sit down with it. It held a revered place. I remember where they kept it on the bookshelf, and there was a certain reverence, if you sat down with that book. They wanted it to be part of our education because they knew that that's not as good as, as well as we were educated in the Minneapolis public school system and at the Catholic schools that we attended, that we weren't getting those lessons. That was a hole in our education.
Yeah, I remember even growing up in DC. Our school books were so old that it used the word Negro. So that's changed now. But these stories that we get at those ages are so important in how we understand the world.
So it's incredible that Joran Kazak is sort of out there in the world. People think he's dead.
Yes.
They've just lost touch, even though Beale Street is dedicated to him. And you're the person who goes and finds him. What did you learn about his relationship to James Baldwin and his impact on him?
Well, one of the reasons that it was hard to find him is that he lived in Tuscan countryside with no telephone, no running water, no electricity. He and his wife, they lived sort of off the land. He would trade paintings with villagers. I mean, he was really an outsider, and I think that's part of what Baldwin was so drawn to. So what I learned, over the course of many years, was that he was one of those people, and there are others that I explore in the book, that Baldwin had this very intense bond with as artists, but also they were lovers, for a period. That was part of their relationship, but not all of it. It went in and out of friendship and other kinds of relationships. Beale Street Could Talk, it's a beautiful novel about a Black love story between a man and a woman in Harlem, but it's actually based on his relationship with Joran Kazak. And, the Fani is behind bars, right, in prison, but for Baldwin and Joran, it's kind of society's taboos around homosexuality, or that was kind of what they were combating. So it was a lesson in how when you're looking at Baldwin's life and his work, you have to always look at these different layers that are happening in his fiction and his nonfiction. And originally, I thought I was just going to write, bring Little Man back into print and write a short piece about that story in Baldwin's life. But as I did more research, I realized, well, guess who introduced Joran Kozak to James Baldwin? Buford Delaney, who the incredible African American poet who was Baldwin's quote unquote spiritual father. And so I already saw that there was this thread throughout his life of these bonds with men that had been explored somewhat in earlier books, but hadn't really been gone in all the way. And that, in fact, to understand Baldwin's writings about love, I mean, all of his novels are love stories. The Fire Next Time is all about how it's love that we need in order to throw open the gates between Black and white Americans to make freedom real. It just sort of organically, over the course of 20 years, became clear that this was the book that I needed to write. Toni Morrison says, you write the book that you want to read. And this was the book that I wanted to read that wasn't there. How his relationships, especially with men, but also with women, Lorraine Hansberry, Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison. I mean, he was, all of these relationships were relationships. They were artistic relationships. They were political relationships. And they really explain Baldwin's life and work.
There are four main relationships that are kind of the tent poles that the book stands on. Can you sort of help us understand the structure and how you chose those particular four relationships?
Sure. So the book is chronological, and it tells Baldwin's entire life story. But it begins, it begins with Bill Miller, but we'll come back to her, his teacher when he's growing up. But the first major figure is Buford Delaney, who Baldwin meets when he's 16 years old. He's a child preacher. He's confused about his sexual identity. And a friend of his at school sends him down to Buford Delaney's studio in Greenwich Village. Baldwin goes in, knocks on the door, and Buford looks at him, and they look at each other, and it's just this moment of recognition. Then Baldwin sees all the paintings he's doing, and he realizes for the first time that a Black man can be an artist. That's how he puts it. And Buford introduced him to blues and jazz, which he wasn't allowed to listen to in his house. He taught him how to look at a gutter on Broadway and see the buildings being reflected back beautifully like a painting. So Buford taught him how to see the world as an artist. So he's the first major figure in the book. And he ends up following Baldwin eventually to Paris when Baldwin goes there. And it's in Paris that Baldwin falls in love for the first time with a young Swiss man named Lucien Habersberger. He's the second major figure in the book. It's Lucien who takes a sick Baldwin to his family's Swiss chalet in the Swiss Alps to nurse him back to health. And that's where he comes up with the title for his first novel. They're going hiking on the mountain. It's Go Tell It on the Mountain. Is the novel. They're listening to Bessie Smith records. So that's the second major figure. They had a lifelong, complicated, rocky love affair, love relationship. He was his great love. He was by Baldwin's bedside when he died, but he also married Diana Sands and had children with another woman. So it was a very complicated relationship. Baldwin based Giovanni's Room in many ways on their love and dedicated that novel to him. He's sensing a theme here. He's dedicating these novels to men like Joran, like Lucien. The third figure is Engin Cezar, a Turkish actor who played Giovanni in an actor studio rendition of it in Greenwich Village. Baldwin follows him back to Istanbul, and that is, in fact, where he finishes Another Country. And you can see at the end of Another Country, it says Istanbul. That's the date line. It's also where he wrote most of The Fire Next Time. People don't know, well, some people do, but many people don't know that Baldwin spent most of the 1960s, his most active period in the civil rights era, obviously, in Istanbul. He called it his home. This is where he went. He was embraced by the intellectuals and the artists and the activists there. And he loved being in a country where he wasn't famous, at least at first, and where he didn't know the language. Because alienation from language and from home was actually this kind of powerful creative tool for him. And then the fourth figure, as I mentioned, was Joran Kozak. And that was his major in the 1970s when he'd moved to the south of France.
He often, I want to come back to the notion of alienation being a fuel for his work in some way. So let's set that aside. But it seems that he was choosing people who were almost unattainable in some ways.
Well, they're connected, right? I mean, I think we have to go way back to understand this dynamic. Okay, so Baldwin grew up being called sissy, being called frog eyes by his father, by other people around him. So his journey to self-love was very complicated and hard won to see himself.
Did he get there?
I do believe he got there, to the extent that we all are always, not quite all the way there. Trying to find it, especially in a country where he grew up being told, both within his community, that he was strange and ugly, and by the wider white American culture, right? He talks about never seeing images of himself, that weren't negative, except His white teacher, Bill Miller, when he was 10 years old, took him to the movie theater and he saw Betty Davis on screen. And her eyes reminded him of his own eyes and of his mother's eyes, which he'd been told were ugly. And this made him realize that that his eyes were in fact powerful. They could be weapons. But your question was about the alienation. So he had to overcome this alienation, right? And had this sort of unattainable love for America in a way. I mean, he wasn't being loved back by that country. He
Mm-hmm.
also did seek out relationships, I believe, that were both powerful and real and combustible and passionate, but also would allow him to be alone. He needed to be alone to write. So he would have these relationships, they would break up, and he would go away and write out of this kind of yearning, this kind of alienation, this kind of desire for reconciliation, which also in a way is the desire for reconciliation or understanding that he was seeking with America as a country.
Mm-hmm.
Right, there was that kind of, it's not a one-to-one relationship, but there's some kind of cross current there. It was very creatively productive for him. It was also very emotionally difficult for him as well. But he was first and foremost an artist. So that was what his priority was, I would say.
And he needed to find the right place to do that work, both physically and the right headspace to do that work. And he was someone, I don't want to say he's comfortable with rejection, but it was so much a part of his life. Rejection, alienation, being misunderstood. In reading this, it seemed at some points he created that dynamic because he needed it as an artist. That, either putting himself in a place where, as you say, he didn't know the language or he didn't understand something, but even in a relationship, forcing a breakup because it was easier to tap into the emotions that he needed to tap into from a point of rejection or alienation than it was out of comfort and the warm embrace of love.
Yes.
Is that a fair assessment?
I think it is. Although, he said, he's talking about Istanbul. He said, from another place, you can see America more clearly because in America, there's nothing to compare America to. So he went over to France, couldn't speak French, and he found that very creatively productive in the beginning, that kind of alienation and being a stranger. He went to that Swiss village with Lucien, and he ended up writing that amazing essay, A Stranger in the Village, because he was the only Black person in sight. The white children were following him around, and he uses that as a springboard, not just for reflecting on America, but kind of like Western civilization in general. And he finishes that essay by saying, the world is white no longer, and it will never be white again. So, he fed on this kind of condition that he put himself in order to kind of extrapolate from that to write, the great works that we have all benefited from so much. Yeah.
Where and how did he develop his voice? Because that's how, thanks to, we'll talk a little bit more about this also, social media has allowed him to live in our imagination in a very vivid way because of all the videos that are in circulation. And he had a very particular cadence to his voice that became more pronounced over time. His critics would say more affected over time. Is that a creation as he was living in Paris and Istanbul and Corsica and all the other places that he lived? Or is that something that was original to his story as a child preacher, where he was at a very young age quite an orator?
I love that question because my partner and I often talk about this later Baldwin voice, this kind of black Atlantic, almost British accent that he shares with Maya Angelou and Eartha Kitt and others. And I'm not going to write it, but I think somebody should write a book about that accent and that history and how that came into the world. But earlier, obviously, the language, his voice comes from sermons. It comes from the Bible. It comes from the church that he grew up in. And he was a really, really pretty well-known child preacher in Harlem from the time he was about 13 to 16. He was in the pulpit. And in a way, he says that he never really left the church, right? He carried that language with him. The Fire Next Time, many of the titles of his books are biblical. The lines from it. It was so much a part of who he was. And that's why I think America was just in shock when he was on television finally, because they'd never seen anyone, let alone a Black man, speak in this way, right? Speak and have such command of his language and his rhetoric and be able to marshal it. Everyone's watched the Dick Cavett show. They've seen the Buckley debate. How often are writers that extraordinary as speakers and orators? He was really kind of deeply unusual in that way. He was strange, right? He was singular in that way. The Black Atlantic voice, I think that came in part out of a desire to kind of code switch, right? And to kind of beat the Buckleys at their own game, saying like, okay, I can talk in this lexicon. I mean, Black Americans have been doing this forever, right? He was just doing it on a grand stage. I can speak one way in this community and I can speak another way in this community. And not only, I mean, he did it. He beat Buckley. I mean, it was hands down. It wasn't even close. And he would, he would, it's really a shame that he didn't get to speak on the March on Washington. And that's a whole other story, because it would have been amazing to see kind of how that could have unfolded. But there are other speeches and interviews that are available on YouTube that people can watch, and I'm sure they have, that just are, absolutely amazing.
I'm glad you gave it a name, the Black Atlantic Voice, because I didn't, there was this, I don't want to say it's an affectation, because I'm not, going to presume that they were making this up, but there was a certain cadence in the voice that sounded like high tea, more than biscuits and gravy. It was, and I just always wondered, where did that come from? Cicely Tyson sometimes had that. It was Diane Carroll sometimes had a little bit of it.
Yes. Maybe you should write this book.
I don't know. I have a lot to do already. But you mentioned the March on Washington. I did not know that he had written something but was not allowed. There were all kinds of dynamics that happened at the March on Washington. The women had to march on a different street than the men on the way to the March on Washington, the lineup. But I did not realize that he was not allowed to speak, and instead his words were given to someone else.
That was one of the crazier moments.
How did you find that?
I read about it, and then I did a bunch of advanced Google searches, and I actually found, in the back of the book, I have the link. So what happened is that he had gone to Paris to kind of do a march with African Americans abroad in support of the March on Washington. And he wrote a beautiful speech kind of about global Black liberation that was part of a scroll that they put together. And he took it back with him. And, the details are murky. He was supposed to read it, and then he wasn't. I mean, Malcolm X had some interesting thoughts about why that happened. And I can talked about it in a minute. But the shocking thing that happened is that this is a essay that he wrote to be read by himself. And instead of having him up there, Burt Lancaster read the speech. And it just sounded, kind of absurd coming out of his mouth. And you can kind of see or hear the crowd just kind of being mystified by what was happening there. And according to Malcolm X, some people say it's because they didn't want a homosexual person up there. Similar issues with Bayard, the incredible Bayard Rustin. And I think there may be an element of truth to that, but I think Malcolm X actually got it even better. Malcolm said they didn't want Baldwin up there because they couldn't control him. They didn't know what he was going to say. He was a preacher. He would speak off the cuff. He was going to go places that were not perhaps where some of the leaders of the civil rights movement went. I mean, the great thing about right now is that there are books coming out that are just showing so many layers to the civil rights movement that haven't been. I'm thinking about Brandon Terry's book that just came out. Peniel Joseph has a book that came out. I mean, we're at an excellent moment right now where writers and scholars are excavating the women's role in the civil rights movement, right? All of that is happening, but there's still things that we don't know. And I certainly did not know that Burt Lancaster was, playing James Baldwin.
And what of all the people? I mean, not Charlton Heston, who maybe would have brought a little something to it, because Charlton Heston was very different then than he was later in life. But Burt Lancaster at that moment was riding high, because I think it was the same year or right before the Nuremberg movie came out, and so he had a series of very big hits, and he was a big man, and was known for Broadway also, but just hard to even imagine him giving voice to something that was so passionately written by James Baldwin.
It's funny that you bring up Charlton Heston. I mean, not to jump ahead, but I think two of the oddest occurrences in the sort of interracial history of this country are that when Baldwin went out to Hollywood in the late 60s to write the screenplay for Columbia Pictures for Malcolm X, he wanted Billy D. Williams to play Malcolm X. But one of the reasons that Baldwin sort of tried to take his own life, actually ended up leaving set and leaving the whole experience, was that Columbia Pictures wanted Charlton Heston to play Malcolm X.
I couldn't even process that.
Yeah.
Like in blackface. I mean, what was the plan there?
I don't know, but it's hard to imagine that it wouldn't have been something extremely disturbing. I mean, that was such a sad. I mean, this is an example of the how much I wish Baldwin was alive now, how grateful I am for Barry Jenkins, Beale Street Could Talk, for Raoul Peck, because Baldwin's his first dream was the novel, but he understood the importance of images. He really, he writes all about that in The Devil Finds Work, how racist these Hollywood films are. He understood why the Black Book was important. And he really wanted all of his novels to be turned into films. He was so passionate about this Malcolm X screenplay. And time again, Hollywood completely disappointed him and really betrayed him, which is why he ended up after that horrible experience with the Malcolm X screenplay. He went to back to Istanbul and he directed a play there, which was this Fortune in Men's Eyes, and he was an incredible director by all accounts. So you wonder like what would have been possible, if James Baldwin had had the access and the support that he deserved as one of the biggest and most important artists of the 20th century.
And Raoul Peck's film is so wonderful because it shows us how America was so deeply invested in the cowboy narrative.
Right.
And just, the role that Hollywood has played in our larger image of America, but also ourselves, how we see ourselves and our place in America. One of the other scenes that I was really interested in, because it's been written about, I think there's only one person still alive who was in the room, is the meeting with Bobby Kennedy.
That was something
And
else.
is Clarence Jones the only person who's still with us?
I am not sure, but if that's the case, we should talk to him because there's still, there's so many differing accounts of what happened that day. And that's part of what was so fascinating about revisiting. I mean, many people have written about that encounter, but all the accounts are different, Baldwin has his account, Lorraine Hansberry has her account, Taylor Branch has his version, that the Kennedys have their version.
Maybe at some point we should get he's still alive, and he's someone that I am in touch with and love very much. And he was Dr. King's personal attorney, so he was also on stage at the March on Washington, and as one of these sort of secret Zelig figures that was everywhere, but most people don't know his story. But the way you walk us into the room is through James Baldwin's lens. And what do we learn in looking at what you were able to see from his particular lens?
Well, what we learn is how strategic he was. I believe, that he was a truth teller. He was a very authentic person, but he was also strategic. He had to be, right? He wasn't involved in the civil rights movement because he really wanted to be. He wanted to be off writing novels. He was involved because he knew he had to be, that he had this unique kind of position and opportunity. So
can you set the stage first, though? So for people who might not know this, so Bobby Kennedy is invited to the salon. Yeah. Can you just explain?
Well, no, Bobby Kennedy, he has breakfast with Bobby Kennedy in McLean, Virginia. And he says, can you put together a group so we can to figure out the Negro problem in the North? And Baldwin says, yes, this is supposed to be kind of a private meeting. Baldwin goes back to New York. And he's trying to get Blues for Mr. Charlie made. He's writing that play, a very political, very radical play. And he's being interviewed by someone in the New York Times, Louis Funke, I believe is his name, who's a theater critic. And they're talking about Blues for Mr. Charlie, and this is in the newspaper the next day. And then at the very end, Baldwin mentions that he's going to have a meeting with Kennedy. And Funke's asks who else is coming, and he lists who's coming, and it's Harry Belafonte and Lena Horne, and all these celebrities, as well as some important political figures like Jerome Smith, relatively unknown but important freedom fighter. So Funke says, "Oh my gosh, can I? That's a big deal. Can I tell my colleagues at the New York Times?" And Baldwin says, "Sure." There were very few Black reporters at the time at the New York Times. Somehow, I believe I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Lamond Robinson gets wind of this. Okay, so he ends up writing the report eventually. And the meeting is a disaster in some ways, right? Because, you have, according to various accounts, when Jerome Smith started kind of saying that, Baldwin was sort of goading him and saying well, would you fight in the military for this country? He said, well, how can I fight in the military for a country that doesn't give me equal rights, And then Lorraine Hansberry, who was more left than Baldwin, was really coming after Kennedy. Baldwin was sort of trying to make everything all right. Kenneth Clark, the really important psychologist, was there. He called it the most dramatic thing he'd ever seen in his life. Part of me thinks that this was a natural occurrence, but part of me thinks is that Baldwin was really trying to do a kind of publicity stunt in order to kind of push Kennedy and the administration to as he put it in the meeting, to take a moral stance, about the treatment of African Americans in this country. Lo and behold, although, he reacted terribly, it was in the news. Lamond Robinson wrote it, and there's these smiling pictures of Lena and Baldwin and Lorraine, not these menacing pictures, right? And I believe that this is what really got us towards the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, was that this kind of public pressure that happened because of that article. But then,
and what kind of pressure did it create then?
Well, I mean, it was just a couple of years later that the government started hiring many more high-ranking African American people in positions of power. And then President Kennedy was even using the language of a kind of moral responsibility that Baldwin had presented in that meeting. So to me, this was like a masterwork in kind of political manipulation, and also being in kind of in cahoots with the press, with Lamont Robinson. Lamont wrote that, okay? And then I believe that the Kennedys got to the Times because a few days later, James Reston, a more conservative reporter, is writing a completely different version of the event where he calls Jerome Smith a savage. I mean, he says that he was behaving like a savage. I mean, the New York Times. So we see how the news is not always objective, or could never be objective, right? In these kind of conflicting accounts in the same newspaper of
Yeah,
this.
someone working back channels to tell their own story. And then there was like Rip Torn was there.
Rip Torn was there because Baldwin was, well, he was in Blues for Mr. Charlie eventually. Baldwin, they were friends, and Geraldine Page as well. But interestingly, when Lamont Robinson reported on it, any of the white people, and there were a few of them who were in the meeting, were taken out, were not mentioned, because perhaps this would have kind of like diluted the message that Baldwin was trying to send, even though he was very much about racial reconciliation and coalition and collaboration. I think there was a way that this had to look a certain way to send a serious message to the president, which it did.
But when Reston wrote about it, it was a very different telling.
Oh yeah. And even the New York Times and in Reston's obituary kind of fessed up to the fact that he was way too close to kind of generals and other people that he was sort of beholden to in his report.
You write about James Baldwin's 3 attempts to leave this world. That had to have been a particularly difficult part of putting this book together.
I did. It was difficult, but I also felt it was really important. I mean, Baldwin is sometimes held up, right, as this icon, as this kind of avatar of the civil rights movement. And I really wanted this book to show how he was a human being and what it cost him to kind of become, quote unquote, a spokesman, right? It was not, we owe a great debt to him as Americans and as people in the world, that he really put his life on the line. He's a very small man. He was traveling down the South when they were burning crosses. He was being followed by the FBI. He watched Malcolm X get killed. He watched Martin Luther King get killed. He was next. He had every reason to believe that he was next. There was one suicide attempt, near suicide attempt in particular, that really hadn't been covered in detail before. It was in Corsica in 1957. This was right before his first trip south. And he went there and he went through a terrible breakup with a young black jazz musician named Arnold. And I went there with my mother, actually, and found the house where no one else, no Baldwin scholar had ever been there, where he had gone. And he has this short piece of writing, really not published, where he writes about that night. He's in the house and he's fought with Arnold. He has a glass of brandy and he goes out onto the terrace, and he doesn't want Arnold or their other friend who's there to know he's leaving. So he climbs over this kind of wall, jumps down with the brandy, goes down to the water, and he thinks of Virginia Woolf. He considers putting rocks in his pockets, and he walks out, takes his shoes off, and he walks out. But he has an epiphany when he's out there. He realizes that it would be selfish of him to do this. And he realizes also that he's been struggling with another country, that he had this novel that he had to write, and that he had this responsibility to his people, the people in the United States, not just Black people, white people as well, that he had this particular opportunity. And that's when he went back. He got back out of the ocean and he went back, continued to write very productively for a few months. And then he visited the South for the first time, met Martin Luther King, sort of rediscovered the power of the church as a place of community. He'd been sort of rejected the church earlier. He went back in the South. He understood that the church was a place of community, but also political mobilization. And this was really transformative for him. So he would always go from these attempted suicides to have these amazing experiences that were galvanizing for his art, like directing the play in Istanbul. So again, they were to really explore in depth, not dwell on them. Not in a, one thing that was really important in this book is there can sometimes be this tendency when we write about Black figures, think of Billie Holiday, to link their genius to tragedy or pathology, or whatever that is. And one thing that I wanted to really think about is that's too easy. What did make Baldwin a genius? What did enable him to do all of this? It wasn't just suffering. I mean, he couldn't have, it was perseverance and it was love. It was all of these relationships, right, that sustained him, and his ability to connect with people. He was able to go and talk to really racist white people. I mean, he had such curiosity and patience, which is why he understood the way white people's minds work better than white people understood their own minds. That's why he could write these essays. That's why he could write the short story Going to Meet the Man from the perspective of this terrible white sheriff. I mean, there takes a certain selflessness and a certain generosity, but also, again, that's strategic. He's talking to these white people because he wants to reach them, but also he's trying to understand them so he can write about them and change
And
the
he was
world.
criticized for that, for working both sides of the street, for actually reaching out to the community. I mean, and even talking to someone like Margaret Mead, in that Rap About Race book, he was really pilloried for that. We had some folks that sent in questions for you. And one of the things that someone noticed is that you managed to get inside his head without overstepping a boundary. And that is a compliment. That's a great compliment. But getting inside James Baldwin's head is its own thing. And I'm sure that you've seen some of the discourse online. Why is this man writing this book? I think that there are people who will pick up the book, not know you, see a picture of you, your hair is pulled back today. It's normally long and flowing and blonde and big. And wait, this is the dude who wrote this book? Why does he get to write that book? Or do we trust him to write that book? Is that something that you just let fall off your shoulders? Or is that something that you really understand and are willing to take on? And how much of that did you face even when you decided to take on this biography? Were there those who did question whether you could actually cross cultural lines and really understand someone like James Baldwin?
I'm so grateful for that question. Well, first of all, I'm grateful that somebody thought that I was able to, effectively render his voice. And we can talk on a kind of formal and structural level and research level, like how I did that. But to address your first point, this is a conversation that we need to have. People sometimes ask me, are you comfortable talking about this? And I'm like, of course I am. I mean, Baldwin was writing all about this, and white Americans have to be willing to talk about it. There's a long history of appropriation of Black cultural forms and erasing Black lives. So this is something we have to talk about. Of course, for me, everybody is different, but I have been thinking about this and not thinking about it my whole life. Growing up in Washington, D.C. at Alice Steele, I was the only white kid on the basketball team, and in the 8th grade, and I had a nickname that I did not understand until years later when I read Baldwin. My nickname was Politics, and I didn't know what that was about. They were saying that the coach, and they were right, only put me on the squad because there needed to be at least one white player. That was me. And when I read Stranger in the Village by Baldwin in college, that it clicked. And again, that was code switching that was happening.
And frankly, that was a really deep nickname, because there were a lot of nicknames they could have given you, but that spoke to the moment in DC and what was going on in DC at the time. I'm speaking to you from DC. Alice Steele is a few blocks away from where I'm actually sitting, right now. But because of what your parents did, you could have well thought it was, oh, they're talking about my folks.
Right. My father's a civil rights attorney and activist. So I thought, oh, maybe it's because he works in politics, sort of. But, it was I mean, you know how it is. It's playing the dozens. It's signifying. You actually, they weren't making fun of me. They knew I ran track too, and I was a really good track runner. So it wasn't like it's just basketball. I mean, I was like 5'4", and everybody was 6'2", and this was 8th grade, and it was a great team. And I sat on the bench the entire season. There was one moment where we were in this big championship game, and I got up because I had a splinter in my behind, and everybody started freaking out because they're like, why is politics going into the game? But I wasn't. I was running to the bathroom to take the splinter out. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. But the point is, in addition to just my experience growing up, I realized that with Baldwin, he taught me so much about what it means to be white. He taught me, he wrote that novel, Giovanni's Room, from the first person perspective of David, who has white blonde hair like I do, but it really was closeted and it was damaging to other people, and it helped me understand the damage that one does to oneself and others if you're not true to yourself. And I remember, when I teach Giovanni's Room, and you see the cover is often a white guy, students are shocked if they don't know Baldwin to see that Baldwin's picture as the author on the back. I try to explain to them, listen, first of all, Baldwin was writing about race in that novel. He was exploring kind of the perniciousness of white American masculinity, but also nobody has sole ownership of anything when it comes to literature, right? And that, in fact, we need more white people reading Baldwin, not fewer. We need deeper dives. We need more conversations happening, like the one that you and I are having right now, and that you have through your race card project. I mean, we need more. We don't need to police certain kind of forces that are dominant in our country right now. Want to ban things, erase things. They want to polarize us, and That's not what Baldwin stood for. So, in that sense, I feel very comfortable having written this book. I also believe, however, that a book is only as good as it is, and you have to be judged by the book. If you do the research, if you're writing from outside of your culture, quote unquote, you better do the research. If somebody writes about a kind of a gay figure and they're not queer or gay, I have my first instinct is also like, oh, I don't know. If they do a great job, then they do a great job. Welcome to the party. That's kind of my philosophy about it.
I was wondering if you were writing in some ways, not necessarily, it's not exactly the same, but when Baldwin said that it benefited that he didn't understand the language, that he wasn't fully legible, that he wasn't, when he was living in Istanbul and when he was
Yeah.
living in Paris, did that benefit you in some way? That you had to cross a cultural line and learn a different language, a different way of being, a different way of seeing the world? And did it benefit you in some way because you couldn't take things for granted?
I think so. And I think there's something about writing a biography, and many biographers will tell you this, that you have to be really careful not to over identify with your subject, right? That you have to keep
Mm-hmm.
that distance. So there was never any danger, as much as I admired Baldwin, as much as I wanted to be a writer because I read Baldwin. I was never confusing myself with him, right? And so I do think that kind of distance is healthy. But I think a Black person could write a biography of Baldwin and have that distance as well, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
certainly I certainly had that. But at the same time, there are people who write really important biographies about horrible figures. I'm thinking of, the Hoover biographies that came out by Beverly Gage. Kai Bird is writing a very important biography. Is coming out about Roy Cohn. We need to explore these complicated,
Mm-hmm.
troubling lives. For me personally, I couldn't spend this. I spent 20 years writing this book. I have to love my subject. I have to love and admire that person in order to write about it. So I tried to bring that to the book as well. That kind of sensitivity. And to go back to your question about like getting into his head, the wonderful thing about Baldwin is that since 2017, with the archives of the Schomburg, also at the Beinecke, we have so much of his own writing and his interviews. So I was able to quote judiciously from his letters. So it really wasn't about getting in his head, because that kind of is appropriate so much as like opening the doors, like
Mm-hmm.
giving a context and letting him speak for himself wherever possible. I mean, and others as well. Just to give you one last example, there are these incredible archives of the Beinecke that David Leeming did interviews with people like
Mm-hmm.
Lucien Happersberger, like David Baldwin, and they hadn't been transcribed. I spent COVID transcribing these. And the book ends with Baldwin's death, as biographies must. But instead of telling it in my voice, I weave my own sort of setting the scene with Lucien Happersberger's narration of being at his bedside. So I can't beat that. You know what I mean?
And
You
it's
can't.
very effective.
Thank you.
It's very effective. I'm so glad we're having this conversation because I was witnessing some of this discourse online, and people were like, girl, why should we trust him to write this book? And I said, I want to have this conversation so people understand the book. Pick up the book and read it, and you'll perhaps understand. One of the things that was hard about this book is also, I guess, I didn't understand how much criticism James Baldwin faced later in life. And whoa, that sort of third chapter of his life, the criticism that he faced, after someone called him the Joan of Arc of the cocktail party, that he was best at writing when he was surrounded by people in posh spaces. And Susan Sontag's just criticism of Blues for Mr. Charlie, when that finally went on Broadway. I mean, and it was just the side of mean in some cases. They had considered him passé. And as you read it, you're wondering, did he change, or did the times change, or why was he held up to that kind of criticism that was just dripping with that much contempt?
Good question. And there are a lot of reasons. There's this whole idea, ridiculous idea, that was very prevalent then, that there could only be one Black author, right? Only one big
Mm-hmm.
Black author. So it
Mm-hmm.
was
Mm-hmm.
Richard Wright, then it was Ralph Ellison and Baldwin, and then Toni Morrison. Finally, a woman was allowed into that conversation, which in fact, if you really look deeply at the history of African American literature, there have been a plethora of incredible authors all the way through. Zora Neale Hurston, Count Cullen, who was Baldwin's teacher, Langston Hughes. I mean, this is a ridiculous notion. It's that there can only be one. But that was something that hit Baldwin for sure. He also kind of played off of it earlier in his career with Richard Wright, but that's a different conversation. But what happened to him, is that two things, I would say, for starters. There was racism and homophobia. And how did that manifest? Well, he also was not willing to kowtow to white liberals anymore. He was the darling of the white liberals when
Hmm.
when Fire Next Time came out, because he was really making an argument about and believed in the possibilities of interracial coalition. When he saw that the civil rights gains didn't really happen, or not with the pace and in the ways that they should have, he was walking away a little bit from that rhetoric. Now, his life was still very interracial in his friendships, but he also started to really understand Malcolm X's points. He started to understand the points of Black nationalists and Black Panthers, Angela Davis and others. He was, he wrote his other No Name in the Street later on. He was really writing not only about his own childhood and experience, but he was writing about the failures of the civil rights movement. White liberals did not like that. They also didn't like another country, right? Because it was going away from, people wanted him to keep writing the same book. I mean, after he wrote Go Tell It in the Mountain, white publishers wanted more of the same. And then he wrote Giovanni's Room. Baldwin was marching to his own drum always, and staying really true to himself. But you'll see in those works, Beale Street Could Talk, this is a story about Black survival, Black love, the Black family, right? Just Above My Head, which was panned, and Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone. Look at Black queer love. Not only that, but Black families accepting their gay children. I mean, this is 1979. This is really remarkable what he was doing. Joseph Lovett, who recently died, he was a TV producer, and Baldwin was supposed to be on 2020. I think Sylvia Chase was her name, interviewed him. Unbelievable footage of James Baldwin at his family home on West 71st Street with the family, with his mother. Such a great interview, and they would not air it because Joseph Lovett was told by the producer that no one was interested in a gay Black passé person. That was the language that was used. So it's not overstating it to say that it was racism and homophobia, but it was also beyond that his politics were more left than mainstream America was ready for.
And didn't that happen with Henry Louis Gates also? He went to interview him for Time magazine, and the Time that had him on the cover said, we're done with him. He's passé.
Exactly. And that was an incredible interview with Josephine, not that just that he was passé, but that Josephine Baker was also passé. But there's going to be an excellent conference in November in Paris about Baker and Baldwin that Henry Louis Gates is putting on, that I'm excited to take part in.
Do you think that he has survived in the way that he has survived now for people of our age, but also for younger people because of technology, because of social media, because he is now, I mean, can't pick up a social media feed. A week doesn't go by without having James Baldwin's videos, wash over me, his quotes wash over me. I mean, he kind of won in the end by survival. This man who was just cast off as someone who is passé is forever current now.
That's right. I love that. I mean, I love that young people are connecting to him. And I think it's for a bunch of reasons. It is that he translates well into kind of our meme world, but also he speaks to all the issues that our young people care about. I mean, the reality is we live in a profoundly interracial country, right? And that was true then, but it's even more true now.
Right. When he said the white world is no more, I mean, he was presaging what we're living in, not just here, but globally.
Globally, exactly. And also, he's funny. He's a truth teller. Young people are looking for that. And, there was an interviewer who asked him, you grew up Black, poor, and gay. Like, how hard was that? And he said, I hit the jackpot, because I have all these perspectives. And he had the unique ability with language to draw upon them. So, you can have a young African-American kid. You can have a young white gay kid. You can have a young African-American gay kid or trans kid. Baldwin was writing about what we'd see as like trans issues now in his late essays. He was talking about androgyny and how we're all androgynous and each contains the other, male and female, white and black, black and white. I mean, he was speaking to our moment back then. I mean, he was even writing about, in his last nonfiction book, Evidence of Things Not Seen, he's writing about the Atlanta child murders, but he was also writing about this moment, this transitional moment where it used to be, underrepresentation or no representation of African. And then suddenly they were, in this child murder case, they were saturating the news cycle. And it makes me think about Elizabeth Alexander's writing about the Trayvon Martin generation and how cell phones, how sadly young people are with images, of their brothers and sisters being killed.
Yeah, death delivered to a small screen.
And Baldwin was already thinking about that. So he's a great writer. He's a great artist. So I think he would be with us no matter what, as a kind of record of history. Unfortunately, that history is still very much living with us. So that just adds to his relevance right now.
Tough thing to bring up, but he was also prone to exaggeration.
Yeah.
He exaggerated some of his relationships, his telling of his his own story was somewhat elastic at times. How did you navigate that?
Well, sometimes it was on purpose, I think, and sometimes it wasn't. So he misremembered Dorothy Counts, the Dorothy Counts encounter. He thought that it happened when he was in France and he saw pictures of it and it sent him running back, but it actually happened a different time. So he was a human being. And he actually wrote about a lot about the fallibility of memory and why he would never write a straight up autobiography because he didn't trust his memory. But I would say that when he was exaggerating, he was being strategic. And I'll give you a couple examples. He would say things like on screen, like "I hoed the cotton," I know, and he wasn't saying that he actually hoed the cotton and that he was a slave, but he understood he was enslaved. He understood that he was fulfilling a kind of symbolic function, in America at that moment. That's what he was saying. Similarly, and in a kind of even more complicated way, when he was having these conversations with Nikki Giovanni and Audre Lorde, he would sometimes kind of mimic a kind of, well, he would say on TV also, I think it was the Dick Cavett show, he said, you're not protecting, I'm going to protect my woman, my children, my, and people were like, Jimmy didn't have any children. But he wasn't pretending that he was, and he wasn't pretending in that moment that he was heterosexual either. He understood again that he was fulfilling this kind of symbolic function, and that he had this opportunity on screen that images mattered, right? Yeah. And he was going to use that moment. So that kind of exaggeration, I think, was very strategic and I think very smart. It worked.
A few questions from people who sent in questions for you. Barbara June Dodge wanted to know, what did he think of his fellow intellectuals toward the end of his life, particularly when he was facing so much criticism?
Well, here's the thing. Baldwin was very, almost too understanding, I would say, of people like Eldridge Cleaver, who would come after him. I mean, if we want to call Eldridge Cleaver an intellectual, that's up for debate. But Baldwin kind of was very generous in that way. He understood the frustrations of the Black Panthers. He understood that they'd been thrown in prison, that they were afraid of being accosted. And, so he was very understanding of that. I think he was saddened by it, but I think his friendship with Toni Morrison was a real counterbalance to that. I mean, you have to remember, she came to St. Paul de Vence. He was struggling to write If Beale Street Could Talk. She came down one night. He read the entire novel to her to see if he got the voice right. I have a beautiful picture, Michelle, I'd love to share with you. It wasn't in the book because it's too grainy, but it's a picture of Baldwin and Toni Morrison in St. Paul de Vence holding hands, smiling, and just looking so happy. And it's an important reminder that Baldwin had a lot of joy in his life. Yes, he had all of these challenges, but he had real kinship. And, his relationships with Black women were really important to him later in his life, in part, I think, because of this rejection by some leading Black male figures. He supported Gail Jones's career, Louise Merriweather. There were other women, Maya Angelou was always a friend of his.
Nikki Giovanni would be included in that. Even though they sparred on screen, it seemed like they had a very close relationship.
They smoked a lot of cigarettes together. I think there was that element, of course, but he also had all of these powerful relationships that sustained him with women. I mean, he said late in his life, he said it really about sort of the wave of Black women that Toni Morrison was part of and kind of ushering in. And he said it really was Black women who were excavating this nation's past now in ways that nobody else had or could. So I look to that rather than focusing on the intellectuals that were against him, which were often sort of white liberals who were disappointed that he was no longer sort of just mouthing.
But also, Amiri Baraka, who later then became, Leroy Jones, who later became Amiri Baraka, was the one who called him the Joan of Arc of the cocktail crowd.
And yet he changed his mind. I mean, his eulogy for Baldwin is gorgeous. Later, he calls him God's revolutionary black mouth. I mean, I think that's the important thing to understand too, is that people had there was a lot going on in the 60s and 70s, and you can forgive people for, I think he did forgive people for misunderstanding him.
There's a power in forgiveness. A couple other quick questions before I let you go. Leilani Brown wanted to know if he accepted as a consequence of being so othered, Black, gay, intellectual in exile, if he accepted loneliness as a consequence of being so othered, or remained hopeful that he would ultimately find what he sought.
That's a beautiful question. I think he wrote about loneliness, how it was a big problem for Americans, period, which is interesting because we're now really talking a lot about that. I think he fed on his loneliness. It was a necessary kind of evil. He needed the loneliness. He needed a kind of melancholy to write out of. And I think, People ask me, did he find that he wanted this great love, or he said he wanted this great love? I think he found it, but not in the singular way, that he wanted or thought he wanted it. He found it in this kind of web of relationships. He wrote that he wanted to create a house at the side of the mountain, on the edge of the sea, and he did that in St. Paul de Vence. And coming through there would be Henry Louis Gates and Josephine Baker and Marlon Brando and Nina Simone, and Buford Delaney, Engin Jazar, Orhan Kazak, Lucien Happersberger. I mean, he had a really, really rich life. It didn't, no, it wasn't, he didn't get married, but he had that fantasy. I mean, I think he had these warring impulses like many of us do, right? But I think ultimately, I think he knew that the loneliness, the intermittent loneliness, was essential for his capacity to create world-changing art.
You talk about his love of family also, and he was very close. There was a niece in particular that he's very, very close to. I actually had a chance to talk to her years ago when she was deciding what to donate to the National Museum of African American History and Culture
Right.
that would honor her uncle. He remained really close to his family.
Yes.
Also, there were moments of alienation, but he took that role really, really seriously. When someone dies, their impact is somewhat flattened. Their persona is somewhat flattened because you only see them, they're reduced in some way to a few quotes, or, the book that we all remember, or the book that is force-fed for some people, as part of some sort of curriculum. And it's one of the wonderful things about this book is that we really see this man in full. Many aspects of his life and his loves. I loved the framing of that. It was a brilliant way, and it obviously was something that you built a house that you could live in for 20 years.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
What is the one thing that you hope people take from the book that might not be so obvious? I mean, I'm always told that biographers sometimes leave Easter eggs in their books, or little nuggets that they hope people will find that might not be obvious. Is there anyone that you would want to share with us?
It's not obvious. That's such a great question. I mean, I think,
Caro does that, Dalek does that. A lot of them do that, and I wonder what it might be in your case.
What do I want people to get from the book? I mean, I think it's kind of what I was just saying. I want them to get, I don't want them to look at Baldwin and see his life as a tragedy. So I won't name the review, but there was a recent review that was very nice, but it said about Baldwin that his life was a failure because he didn't find that one love, and because he didn't solve racism. And I thought, that's not his responsibility. That's our responsibility. And actually, that's white America's responsibility. The racism was created by white America. We are the ones who need to face it and solve it. So it's not, Baldwin helps get us there. We should all be grateful to him. So that wasn't a failure. And like we just talked about, his search for love was not a failure. I mean, he had so much love in his life, for family, for lovers, for spiritual fathers, for collaborators, for his country, for the world, And I'm really glad that you brought up Aisha, because she and her brother Tijan, when Little Man came out, the book is based on them. And so I asked them to write the afterword and the foreword, and they wrote these gorgeous short pieces about the story about how the book even happened, which was that Tijan, who's TJ in the book, kept saying, Uncle Jimmy, when are you going to write a book about me? And he kept saying, oh, someday. And then he finally did. And one Thanksgiving, the books arrived and ran to the box of books, and they opened it up, and there they were. And this was a book of love for those kids. He dedicated the book to Buford Delaney, who was sort of struggling with his health in the later years of his life. So let's focus on Baldwin's successes and his attention to love, because that is what we need now. That is what is going to propel us forward to continue in his tradition to kind of make freedom real in this country and the world.
When I sent this out on the socials that I was going to be interviewing you, a couple of people had memories that maybe you can follow up on, but were really beautiful about when James Baldwin would visit their campus. Yeah. And that he would hang out afterwards and sit on the couch with students. And wow, the idea of having James Baldwin visit your campus and then hang out and have fried chicken with you, and sit on a radioed couch and tell his story. So
that's been one of the great pleasures of this book tour is meeting people coming up to me and having their stories about meeting him in various places. In LA, I did an event with Lena Waithe, and in the audience was David Moses, this beautiful elderly Black actor who was in some of Baldwin's performances, but who also was the man who called Baldwin to tell him that MLK had been shot when he was in Palm Springs. So to have people like that in the audience, and that's the last thing I would sort of say, is that to meet these people who knew Baldwin is to understand how much his life was about love, because that's all they can talk about. Now, they're not talking about that book wasn't well received, or he had an unhappy relationship. They're always talking about love, all of them.
What a wonderful epitaph in life.
Yeah, for real.
To leave literally a trail of love wherever you went.
That's right.
I have loved this conversation. Thank you very much, Nick. I appreciate your time.
I appreciate everything you do, Michelle. It's great to see you again.
Look forward to seeing you again soon.
Great.
Best to Marlon.
I will. I'll tell him.